For 5 years, my husband hasn't moved an inch without my help. One day, I came home early and saw the muddy boots by the back door, caked in fresh, dripping mud. The wheelchair was empty, and the man I've bathed, dressed, and carried for 2,000 days was not there. But his muddy boots are sitting there, still dripping. How was this possible? Did someone break in and take him? My mind began to reel. Was I witnessing a medical miracle, or was I standing in the middle of a nightmare I didn't yet understand? Before we further dive into the story, comment below from which city you're watching. I want to know where you're joining me from today. I remember the exact weight of the groceries in my arms as I stepped through the threshold at 2:15 p.m. Usually, the house has a specific smell at that hour: antiseptic, lavender, and the heavy, stagnant air of a sick room. I had come home early because the grocery store was out of the specific organic meal replacements Mark claimed were the only thing his damaged digestive system could handle. I wanted to surprise him with some fresh soup instead. But as the door clicked shut behind me, the silence wasn't the peaceful kind. It was heavy. It was a vacuum. I walked toward the living room, my sneakers squeaking against the hardwood. My heart did a strange, erratic dance in my chest. "Mark?" I called out. No answer. I rounded the corner, expecting to see him sitting by the window, his legs covered by that blue fleece blanket I'd washed 1,000 times. But the chair was empty. The blue blanket was pooled on the floor like a discarded skin. The room was freezing, the back door slightly ajar. And there, resting on the premium slate tile I'd paid for by working double shifts, were his hiking boots. They were caked in fresh, dark mud. I didn't scream. I didn't even drop the bags. I just stood there, staring at the muddy tread. My mind tried to invent 1,000 logical lies to protect my heart. Maybe someone broke in. Maybe a neighbor moved him. But the boots were his size 11s, and the mud was still glistening, a vibrant, earthy red that only comes from the trail behind our woods. My husband hasn't stood on his own 2 feet since the accident 5 years ago. I have spent every waking hour since then being his hands, his feet, and his servant. I've developed chronic back pain from lifting his dead weight into the tub. And yet, the wheelchair was empty and the boots were wet. I felt a sudden, sharp chill crawl up my spine. A floorboard creaked directly above my head. It wasn't the soft, tentative creak of a house settling. It was the firm, rhythmic thud of a man walking with purpose. The weight of a lie is heavy, but the weight of the truth is crushing. I realized in that moment that the man I'd been mourning while he was still alive was a phantom. I was living with a predator who had perfected the art of the victim. I knew I had to move. I quietly backed out of the kitchen, my movements fluid and ghost-like, honed by years of trying not to wake a sleeping patient. I slipped out the front door and ran to my SUV. I didn't start the engine. I just sat there, clutching the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, watching the upstairs window. My mind raced back to the night of the accident, the rainy highway, the unidentified car that clipped him, the doctors who said his spinal cord was a mess of bruised tissue. Mark had been so brave. "Elena," he would whisper, "I'm so sorry I'm a burden." I had worked myself to the bone to prove he wasn't. I sold my grandmother's engagement ring to afford the specialized ramp. I gave up my career in interior design to become a full-time nurse. I had been all in while he was just playing in. But why? Why spend 5 years in a chair if you can walk? Why watch your wife wither away from exhaustion? I looked at the house, our beautiful, sprawling colonial, and realized the settlement money, the $3 million insurance payout we received 3 years ago. It was supposed to be in a trust for his long-term care. I had never touched a penny of it, living instead off my meager freelance checks and his disability crumbs. I had been the perfect character in his tragic play. I was the loyal wife that made the insurance company's heart bleed. I took a deep breath, the air in the car feeling thin and metallic. I couldn't go in there and scream, not yet. I needed to see it for myself. I needed to know the depth of the hole he had dug for me. I waited for 20 minutes, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. Finally, I saw the curtain in the living room twitch. Then, through the glass, I saw him. Mark. He moved into the frame, sitting in the wheelchair, pulling the blue blanket over his lap with the practiced grace of a seasoned actor. He adjusted his expression into that vacant, weary stare he always wore. He was back in character. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to roll down the window. The man I loved was a hollow shell, a master of gaslighting who had turned our marriage into a long con. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway slowly. I drove to a nearby park and sat on a bench, watching the ducks, my mind finally beginning to sharpen. The grief was still there, but it was being rapidly overtaken by a cold, calculating rage. He thought he was the puppet master. He thought I was just the help. I began to plan. I couldn't just leave. He would find a way to flip the narrative. I needed evidence that was indisputable. I needed to see him stand. I needed to see him walk. And I needed to make sure that when he finally fell, there would be no one there to catch him. I decided then that I would go back. I would play the role of the doting, tired wife for a few more days. I would touch his lifeless legs and look into his lying eyes. I would let the dread simmer. I spent the next 4 hours in a daze, buying small, inconspicuous items, a hidden camera disguised as a bookshelf speaker, a set of high-tensile tools, and a heart that was rapidly turning to stone. I practiced my "I'm home" voice in the car until it sounded normal. I had to be perfect. If I tripped over a single word, he would know. And if he knew I knew, the millions of dollars and the 5 years of my life would be gone forever. When I finally pulled back into the driveway at 6 p.m., the sun was dipping below the trees, casting long, skeletal shadows across the lawn. The house looked like a tomb. I walked inside, the smell of antiseptic hitting me like a physical blow. "Elena, is that you?" His voice called out from the living room. It was that same weak, trembling tone that used to make my heart ache. Now it made my skin crawl. "It's me, honey," I replied, my voice steady, professional. "The store was packed. I'm so sorry I'm late." I walked into the room. He was there, in the chair, the muddy boots nowhere to be seen. He looked at me with those big, soulful eyes. "I missed you," he said. "The house is so quiet when you're gone." I leaned down and kissed his forehead. His skin felt normal. His heart, I'm sure, was beating just fine. I felt the familiar weight of his disability pressing down on me, but for the first time, I wasn't carrying it. I was just observing it. The weight of a lie is heavy, but I was beginning to find my strength. "I'll get started on dinner," I said, turning away so he wouldn't see the fire in my eyes. "I thought we could try that new soup today." As I walked into the kitchen, I glanced at the floor where the boots had been. The tile was spotless. He had cleaned the mud. He was careful. He was fast. But he wasn't fast enough. I had seen the truth, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. How much longer could he keep this up? How many other secrets were buried in this house? I looked at the locked basement door at the end of the hallway. He always told me it was just storage for his old work equipment, things that hurt too much to look at. Now I wondered what was really behind that door. Was that where he kept the rest of his life? I knew one thing for certain. The next 48 hours would be the most difficult of my life. I would have to be his hands. I would have to wash his body. I would have to listen to his lies. But every time I felt like breaking, I would remember those muddy boots. I would remember the creak of the floorboards. I'm going to make him stand up. I'm going to make him walk right into the trap I'm setting. And then I'm going to watch his world collapse, just like mine did 5 years ago. The next 48 hours felt like a slow-motion descent into a fever dream. I was a ghost haunting my own life, moving through the motions of a marriage that had become a crime scene. Have you ever had to hug someone while your skin was screaming to get away? That's what it's like to live with a man who has weaponized your own empathy against you. Before we get into the grueling details of how I set the trap, make sure you've liked this video. It really helps me tell these stories of justice. Dinner that first night was an exercise in pure agony. I sat across from Mark, watching him struggle to lift his spoon, his hand shaking with a practiced, rhythmic tremor. I used to find that tremor so heartbreaking. Now I just found it impressive. He was a virtuoso of deceit. "It's a little salty today, Elle," he whispered, his voice thin and fragile. I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized that for 5 years he hadn't just been stealing my money, illegally milking an insurance payout. He'd been stealing my youth. He'd watched me age 10 years in 5, my hair thinning from the stress of his medical emergencies, while he sat in that chair, secretly resting, secretly healthy. "I'm sorry, honey," I said, my voice dripping with a sweetness that felt like poison in my mouth. "I've just been so tired lately. My back has been acting up." I watched his face for a flicker of guilt. There was none, just a shallow nod of acknowledgement before he went back to his struggle. The weight of a lie is heavy, but the silence between us was becoming deafening. That night, the physical reality of the betrayal hit a new peak. I had to help him into bed. This was the ritual I'd performed thousands of times, bracing my feet, hooking my arms under his, and hauling his paralyzed torso from the chair to the mattress. Usually I'd be panting by the end, my spine clicking in protest. But tonight, as I gripped his waist, I felt the muscle. I felt the tension in his core. He wasn't dead weight. He was bracing himself. He was helping me lift him just enough so I wouldn't actually break my back, but not enough to reveal he was functional. The level of calculation required for that kind of physical manipulation is sociopathic. I lay in the dark next to him, listening to him breathe. He fell asleep instantly, the sleep of a man with no conscience. I waited until 3 a.m., my eyes wide and burning in the darkness. I needed to see that basement. I slipped out of bed, moving with the precision of a cat. I didn't use a flashlight. The blue moonlight spilling through the windows was enough. I reached the basement door. Locked, of course. But I knew where he kept the emergency key, hidden inside a hollowed-out book in his study. The key turned with a soft, metallic click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet house. I descended the stairs, the air growing colder, smelling of damp earth and something else something expensive. When I reached the bottom, I didn't find old work equipment. I found a sanctuary. There was a high-end treadmill tucked into the corner, its belt still slightly warm. There was a small desk with a laptop and 3 external hard drives. And in the corner, a rack of clothes I'd never seen him wear, expensive hiking gear, designer sneakers, and a pair of those muddy boots, now cleaned and gleaming. I opened the laptop. He hadn't even bothered to password protect it. He was that confident in my submission. What I found made the blood drain from my face. It wasn't just insurance fraud. He had been running a disability lifestyle vlog under a pseudonym. He'd been filming me without my knowledge for years. There were folders titled The Caretaker's Toll, Authentic Grief, and The Long Play. He was monetizing my suffering, using hidden cameras in the living room and bedroom to capture my most vulnerable moments of exhaustion and prayer, selling them to some twisted corner of the internet that thrived on inspirational tragedies. The accident wasn't an accident. It was a career move. He had cashed out on the insurance, and then he had doubled down by turning our life into a reality show where I was the only person who didn't know the cameras were rolling. My hands began to shake, not with fear, but with a cold, predatory clarity. I didn't take the laptop. I didn't change anything. I just copied a few key files to a thumb drive and relocked the door. I went to bed and lay next to him, my heart a cold stone. The next morning, the performance began. I was the perfect, doting wife. I made him breakfast, I kissed his cheek, but while he was napping in the afternoon, I went to work. I wasn't just a victim anymore, I was a technician. I went to the garage and grabbed a pair of needle-nose pliers and a socket wrench. I returned to the living room where his wheelchair sat empty while he was being assisted to the bathroom by the temporary nurse I'd hired for the afternoon, a luxury I'd told him we couldn't afford, but I insisted on so I could go for a much-needed walk. I knelt by the chair. These chairs are built to be sturdy, but they rely on quick-release pins for the wheels to make them transportable. I didn't remove the pins entirely. I filed down the locking mechanism just enough so that they would hold the weight of a sitting man, but the moment he shifted his weight to stand or sit back down with force, the lateral pressure would cause the wheels to shear off. It was a mechanical ticking clock. Then I placed the speaker. It looked like a standard Bluetooth speaker, but tucked inside the mesh was a 4K wide-angle lens. I synced it to my phone, testing the feed. The view was perfect. It caught the wheelchair, the back door, and the hallway. I had become the director of his final scene. "Elena, where are you?" His voice drifted from the hallway, that pathetic, thin reed of sound. "Just tidying up, honey," I called back, my voice chirpy, bright. I tucked the tools into my waistband and smoothed my hair. I walked toward him, seeing the nurse helping him back into the room. I felt a pang of guilt for the nurse. She was just another pawn in his game, but I couldn't stop now. "I'm going to run to the store for a bit," I said, leaning down to tuck the blue fleece blanket around his useless legs. I made sure to touch his knees, feeling the solid, hidden strength of his quadriceps. "I forgot the ingredients for that special dessert you like." He smiled at me, a slow, indulgent smile. "Take your time, Elle. You deserve a break." I walked out the front door, the sun hitting my face for the first time in 5 years. I didn't go to the store. I drove 2 blocks away, parked under a large oak tree, and pulled out my phone. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. The weight of a lie is heavy, but the weight of the truth is about to break him. I opened the app. The screen flickered to life. The living room was quiet. I watched as the nurse left, her shift over. Mark was alone. For 10 minutes, he sat perfectly still, staring out the window, maintaining the mask just in case I walked back in. Then, Slowly, his posture changed. The slump disappeared. His shoulders squared. He looked around the room, his eyes sharp and predatory. He didn't know I was watching. He didn't know that the loyal wife was currently a silent witness to his resurrection. I watched as he gripped the armrests of the chair. He wasn't struggling. He was stretching. He stood up, fluidly, easily, and stretched his arms over his head, a satisfied groan audible through the speaker's microphone. He walked to the kitchen, his gait perfectly normal, and grabbed a beer from the back of the fridge, the hidden stash I wasn't supposed to know about. I sat in my car, hot tears of rage stinging my eyes. Seeing it in person was one thing, but seeing it on screen, knowing he was laughing at me in his head, was another. He walked back to the chair, beer in hand, looking like a man who had won the lottery. He went to sit down, not gently, but with the heavy, arrogant flop of a man who owns the world. I held my breath. My thumb hovered over the record button. What happens when the man who can't walk finally takes a seat he can't get out of? I watched the screen of my phone with a detachment that terrified me. On the small display, Mark was a different man. He stood in the center of our living room, the paralyzed hero of a tragedy that didn't exist, swigging from a bottle of premium ale. He even did a little mock stretch, twisting his torso from side to side, the very spine I had spent 5 years worrying over, now supple and strong. But before we get to the moment the floor literally fell out from under him, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt like you were being gaslit by someone you loved? Drop a yes in the comments if you've ever had to trust your gut over someone else's lies. The silence in my car was thick, broken only by the sound of my own shallow breathing. On screen, Mark finally decided his break was over. He walked back to the wheelchair with the swagger of a man who had successfully conned the world. He didn't just sit, he dropped. He let his full weight fall into the seat, expecting the familiar support of the frame I had maintained so meticulously. The sound was a sharp metallic crack that echoed through my phone's speakers. In an instant, the left wheel buckled. Because I had filed the pins to a razor-thin margin, the lateral force of his swagger sheared the metal like butter. The chair tilted violently to the left. Mark's eyes went wide, not with the fear of a disabled man falling, but with the panicked reflex of an athlete losing his balance. His legs, those dead limbs, shot out instinctively to brace himself. He hit the floor hard, the chair collapsing on top of him in a heap of tangled chrome and blue fleece. I watched him scramble. It was pathetic. He didn't lay there waiting for help. He hopped up to his feet, cursing loudly, kicking the broken wheel across the room in a fit of rage. He stood there, chest heaving, hands on his hips, staring at the wreckage of his throne. The weight of a lie is heavy, but the gravity of the truth is unavoidable. He had no idea he was being recorded. He had no idea that his miracle recovery was being saved to a cloud server 3 miles away. He spent the next 20 minutes trying to fix the chair. I watched him huffing and puffing, bending over, using his full strength to try and jam the sheared pin back into the axle. He was sweating. He was angry. He looked like a man who had been inconvenienced, not a man who had been cured. Finally, realizing the chair was beyond his immediate repair, he dragged it toward the closet, hiding the broken evidence, and opted for an old, dusty backup chair we kept in the garage. He restaged the scene, sitting back down, pulling the blanket over his legs, and resuming his frail persona just as the sun began to set. I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. The trap had worked. I had the footage of him standing, kicking and swearing. But I wasn't done. I needed to see his face when the mask was stripped away in person. I didn't want a legal battle, I wanted an execution of his ego, of his pride, and of the hold he had over my life. I waited until 7:30 p.m. I drove back home, pulling into the driveway with the same slow, rhythmic crunch of gravel I always made. I walked through the front door, carrying a single bag of groceries, the ingredients for the dessert that didn't exist. The house was quiet again. The smell of antiseptic was back, but this time it smelled like a hospital morgue. "Mark, I'm back," I called out. My voice was different now. It wasn't the chirpy, tired wife. It was low. It was steady. It was the voice of a woman who had already moved on. I walked into the living room. He was sitting in the backup chair, his face pulled into that familiar mask of weary suffering. "You were gone a long time, Elle," he said, his voice trembling perfectly. "I was starting to worry. I had a bit of a scare. The chair felt a bit wobbly earlier." I didn't answer. I didn't put the groceries down. I just stood in the doorway, looking at him. The silence stretched between us like a tightening wire. I let it hang there for 10, 20, 30 seconds. I watched the first flicker of genuine unease cross his face. "Elena?" he asked, his voice losing some of its sickly quality. "Is something wrong?" I walked over to the coffee table and set my phone down, face up. I didn't say a word. I simply pressed play on the recording from 30 minutes ago. The room was filled with his own cursing. The screen showed him standing, vibrant and angry, kicking the wheelchair wheel across the slate floor. I watched his face as he watched himself. The transition was fascinating. First shock, then a brief desperate attempt to find a lie. His mouth opened as if to say it was a miracle that happened while I was gone. But then he looked at me. He saw my eyes. He saw the cold, dead vacuum where my love used to be. The mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. He didn't try to play the miracle card. He knew he was caught. He sat up straight in the chair, truly straight, and his trembling in his hands stopped instantly. His face hardened into something sharp and ugly. "How long?" he asked, his voice deep, resonant, and entirely healthy. "Long enough to see the boots, Mark," I said. My voice was a whisper, but it cut through the room like a blade. "Long enough to see the basement, Mark. Long enough to see the vlogs where you sold my tears to strangers." He chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that made my skin crawl. "Well," he said, leaning back and crossing his legs, those legs that supposedly couldn't feel anything. "So, what now? You call the cops? You call the insurance company? You'll lose everything too, Elena. This house, the money, it's all tied to us. You're an accomplice if you knew." "I didn't know," I said, stepping closer, "and that's the difference. I was the victim of a fraud, just like the bank, but unlike the bank, I have 5 years of invoices for my soul." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the thumb drive from the basement. "This contains your vlog archives, your offshore account numbers, and the raw footage of you standing over me while I slept, laughing at how tired I looked. I'm not calling the police, Mark. Not yet." He narrowed his eyes. "What do you want?" "I want the miracle to happen tonight, Mark. I want you to get up, I want you to walk out that door, and I want you to never look back." The weight of a lie is heavy, but the price of freedom is higher than he ever expected. He looked at me, realizing I wasn't joking. I wasn't looking for a settlement. I was looking for an exorcism. But Mark wasn't the type to go quietly. He stood up, towering over me, his physical presence designed to intimidate. "And if I don't," he hissed, "this is my house. That's my money." "It was," I said, holding up my phone, showing him the send button on an email addressed to the lead investigator of the insurance fraud division. "But if you're still in this house in 10 minutes, I press this, and we can see how the paralyzed man likes a prison cell without a ramp." The silence in the room was suffocating. Mark stood there, fully upright, a man who had spent 60 months pretending to be a shadow, now casting a long, dark one over me. He looked down at his own legs, then back at my phone, his jaw tightening so hard I could hear his teeth grind. He was a cornered animal, and for a split second, I saw a flash of genuine violence in his eyes. But I didn't flinch. For 5 years I had carried him. I knew exactly how much strength he lacked in his soul, even if his body was whole. Before I tell you how this final confrontation ended, make sure you're subscribed. You don't want to miss the next story of a woman reclaiming her power. "You think you're so smart," Mark spat, the frail voice now replaced by a cold, arrogant baritone. "You think you can just kick me out of my own life? I built this, Elena. Every cent of that settlement, every view on those vlogs, that was my genius. You were just the supporting actress. You were the background noise." I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. The insults didn't sting because they came from a stranger. The man I had loved was a fiction I had co-authored with my own hope. This man, he was just a thief who had overstayed his welcome. I wasn't an actress, Mark. I was the person who actually loved you. But you're right about one thing. The show is over, and the background noise is finally speaking up. I watched him glance at the front door, then back at me. He was weighing the cost of a physical struggle versus the cost of a prison sentence. He knew that if he touched me, if he tried to take that phone, the accidental nature of his fraud would vanish instantly. He would be a violent felon, not just a white-collar con artist. The weight of a lie is heavy, but the prison of your own making is tighter. He realized, with a visible slump of his shoulders, that he had no cards left to play. "Fine," he whispered, the word dripping with venom. "Keep the house, keep the crumbs. You'll be broke in 6 months without my disability checks anyway." "I'd rather be broke and standing than rich and hiding in a chair," I replied. I stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. 10 minutes, Mark. I've already called a car. It's waiting at the end of the driveway. You take your hiking boots, your laptop, and the clothes from the basement. Everything else stays, especially the chair. I want to watch the garbage truck take that away tomorrow morning." He moved past me, his shoulder brushing mine, a final petty act of aggression. I watched him go upstairs. I heard the frantic thud of his footsteps, real footsteps, as he threw his hidden life into a duffel bag. Downstairs, I stood in the center of the living room, looking at the empty backup wheelchair. It looked like a hollow skeleton. I realized then that the weight I had been feeling for 5 years wasn't his body. It was the energy it took to sustain a lie I didn't even know I was telling. 7 minutes later, he descended the stairs. He looked different in his hiking gear, stronger, faster, and utterly unrecognizable. He didn't look at me as he reached the front door. He just gripped the handle, his knuckles white. "You'll regret this, Elena," he said, not looking back. "You're nothing without a tragedy to fix." "Actually," I said, my voice echoing in the now empty-feeling house, "I'm looking forward to being nothing for a while. It's better than being your fool." He slammed the door. I watched through the window as he walked down the driveway, not limping, not struggling, but jogging toward the waiting black car. He vanished into the night, taking his 5 years of secrets with him. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the house finally feeling light. I walked over to the coffee table, picked up my phone, and I didn't hit send on the email to the insurance company. Not yet. I had a better plan. I took the thumb drive and the footage of his recovery and sent it to a very specific lawyer, one who specialized in clawing back assets from fraudulent spouses. I didn't want him in jail where I'd have to think about him. I wanted him broke. I wanted every cent of that $3 million settlement returned to the people he stole it from, and I wanted my caregiver wages paid out of his hidden offshore accounts. I sat down in the spot where his wheelchair used to sit. I felt the sun-warmed floorboards beneath me. For the first time in 2,000 days, I didn't have to plan a meal, schedule a physical therapy session, or lift a man who didn't want to stand. The weight of a lie is heavy, but the first breath of truth is like oxygen to a drowning soul. The next morning, I didn't wake up at 5 a.m. to the sound of a bell. I woke up at 9 a.m. to the sound of birds. I walked into the living room and dragged the broken wheelchair and the backup chair out to the curb. As the garbage truck's hydraulic lift crushed the metal frames into scrap, I felt a physical shift in my own body. My back didn't ache. My head didn't throb. I was 28 years old again, with a whole life ahead of me that didn't involve carrying a predator. Mark tried to sue for the house a month later. He claimed I had forced him into the fraud. But the footage of him laughing while I cried, the footage he had filmed himself, was his undoing. The judge didn't just dismiss his case, she referred him to the district attorney. Last I heard, he's working a very real, very physical job in a state penitentiary. He finally has to use his legs for something useful. As for me, I sold the Colonial. I bought a small cottage by the sea, a place with no ramps and no antiseptic smells. I started my interior design business again, focusing on spaces that bring people peace. Sometimes when I'm walking along the beach and I see a pair of footprints in the wet sand, I think about those muddy boots. I think about how close I came to spending my entire life serving a ghost. I'm not a widow. I'm not a victim. I'm a woman who learned that some people will stay paralyzed just so they can watch you carry them. But once you put them down, you realize you were always the one with the power to walk away. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and reclamation, click the video on the screen now for another story of high-stakes betrayal. And remember, trust your gut, because the truth always leaves a footprint.